After that class.
All right, it's time to get started, and today we're doing our exam review. So I'm going to sit here and stare awkwardly at people until I get questions.
What is the statistical probability I can get away passing the test, answering only 42 for all questions? It is the meaning of life.
Less than 42%.
Right. If you get them exactly 42, that's not bad odds.
So I
Right
noticed,
there, yeah.
I noticed on the study guide, there's nothing about slide deck 7. Is there a reason for that?
So I actually learned where slide deck 7 disappeared to and why it was numbered as such. There was a testing slide deck in there that we covered, but since it wasn't on the study guide that I posted, I am not counting it as something that I can ask a question over. So yeah, there's a missing slide deck and associated content. When I originally put this out there, I thought, in the process of reorganizing my slides from the last time I taught this course to trying to move it over into a 2-quarter course, I took a slide deck 8 and put it where a slide deck 7 would have gone without changing the number. In reality, there was a slide deck 7, but it mostly covers things that either software engineering would have covered or we covered in kind of the testing related questions from the first exam. So I think even if it had made it onto the study guide, I wouldn't have written a question on it.
Okay.
Anything that's actually on the study guide are the only kinds of questions or the kinds of content that I would ask a question about.
Are you gonna have us make a paper prototype for the exam?
Maybe. Within my right to do, but do note that from my perspective, I have all of those outcomes on the study guide. I need to make sure that they each get their time to shine as a question. So if I design some kind of make you make a paper prototype on an exam, I would be thinking this has to be doable in 15 minutes or less. So that would be the type of design that I would have to go through to be able to do something that in depth.
Have you finished writing the exam?
I have. I finished it yesterday. We'll probably take one more pass over it.
How many questions?
That's always hard because I make questions with parts, and some of those parts have parts, and some of those parts have multiple components to their answers.
How many numbered questions?
I think there were 6 numbered questions.
All right.
Is it more or less than the last exam?
It's probably, I tried to make it slightly shorter. I don't know if I ended up making it slightly shorter, so it's probably close-ish to that length. To make up for it, I did increase the total number of points to 118 and still grading it out of 100. So even if you're not able to finish the exam, there would still be the ability to score well as long as the work that you do is good work.
How many pages?
I think it's 3 front and back, 6 total pages.
Okay.
But a lot of them are free form writing types of questions.
Got a
So
lot
I
of
try
blank
to,
space.
yeah, there's a lot of blank space.
Yeah.
And mostly short answer questions?
Yeah, I very rarely do anything that isn't a short or long form answer question.
And comparatively, remind us how many pages was the previous one?
It was 4 front and back, if I remember.
Yeah, it was either 7 or 8.
Okay.
It didn't feel like it.
It definitely did not.
I tried to be a little bit less. The tetrad questions on the first exam were a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So there's nothing quite that in depth. That's another reason why I pushed the exam back a week, because I wanted to make sure that there wasn't, all right, well, I don't know what else to write a question on. I guess I have to write more of these.
But yeah, are you gonna give us like a mock game and then have us balance it?
Probably not in an exam setting.
Okay.
Those mostly just gonna be questions.
If I did, then maybe there's a mock mechanic or something similar to the slides where I showed you the cumulative sum of all of the character stats, something like this, and then say, analyze this and talk about why this is either balanced or not balanced, or what would need to be true for this to be balanced, what would need to be true for this to not be balanced. Something that would be a little bit narrower in scope than design something from scratch. An entire game from scratch or an entire mechanic that it's balanced or imbalanced. Yeah, I have to be very careful, especially in a class like this. People can go down rabbit holes of designing something and not realize that the rest of the exam left to do. So I try to make my questions fairly self-contained. I don't know how successful I am at that, but I try.
For going back to the paper prototype, one of the like questions on the exam guide is how will you design game objects for paper use? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in a digital game, you have lots of game objects that represent different elements of that gameplay. When you're converting something that will eventually be a digital game down into a paper prototype, how are you representing those digital objects on paper? Because it could be that there's a very complicated algorithm dictating how much of something you have, the associated logic. When you're doing this on paper, you don't have a CPU with billions of calculations per second to be able to do that for you. So how are you keeping track of something that's complicated digitally on paper when you design a prototype? Does that mean that it's a good idea to make a paper prototype in the first place? Or should you maybe think of how can I reduce the complexity of this mechanic so that I can emulate it on paper? Is that emulation going to lead to less accurate data that I collect about how this game feels to play when I implement the more complicated version digitally? In case it's not apparent yet, I like critical thinking exams. I don't know if that's good or bad, but just about every question is not, do you know it or not? It's apply this concept, generate something for yourself, come up with an example, be able to distinguish between the right time and the wrong time for this. Weigh the benefits and detriments.
I feel like it depends on what version.
For a paper prototype, are we allowed to use things? Are we allowed to use things that are not paper? Like if I had a game that had RNG mechanics, would it be reasonable to say for the paper prototype, roll a D20?
Oh, yeah.
for this?
Absolutely. Anything that can be physically done during that. A paper prototype just basically means turn it into a board game or turn it into something that can be played with a bunch of people sitting around you and no computer. So any randomizer technology is okay. So dice, you could use spinners, you could use
Cards.
cards. Yep.
Post-it notes.
Changing the.
Someone has their sheet of paper in front of them. Even you.
Colored markers, Lego.
For randomizing.
Legos for randomizing. I like it.
Well, not for randomizing, but like the.
It'd be great. Just put it in front of the 3-year-olds and whatever they make, just make that a game on.
To quickly build models or ideas.
Yeah, yeah. So something that visually represents the game so you can get a sense of that. Just have an intuitive idea of what makes sense and what doesn't. What's going to allow you to collect the most useful and relevant data when you go to play this paper prototype. Does it save you time over implementing the digital product?
Underneath, how could a PvP game be balanced? The question is how to design it for multiple viable strategies. Is that asking how to design for the off imbalance if the game has multiple viable strategies?
Yeah, so something like, how are you considering the starting states? Because in a PvP game, everyone needs to be starting from an equal situation. As you're going through this, there's going to be some kind of back and forth for that. So as you're designing for that balance, how do you ensure that your mechanics are lining up with a good play experience?
So for a question like that, is it more like you want us to talk about the things to think of to make it balanced, or are you gonna give us an example and be like, hey, here's these things, what should I look at to balance this PvP experience?
Depends. If I were to do something that was self-contained, I would want to give you the data or give you the game. And I recognize that not everyone has played the same subset of games, so I try not to do that where I can. Even if I do something like I've actually done this historically, pick one of these 5 games and I choose very different games, assuming that people in the class have played one of these 5 very popular games that are very distinguished from each other, but all are good examples for how to, and then I had 3 or 4 people raise their hand. I haven't played any of these games. So now I just say, generate a game and make sure that you're describing this game as if the grader of this exam has never played it. So something like that. If you I will also allow you to invent your own game if you want to come up with something very simple and self-contained that you just had rattling around in your brain. I wouldn't usually recommend doing that. Pick something that actually exists if you want to analyze something like that, but I try to make things open-ended enough that there's not one right example for you to choose. You just choose the example and then justify how it's related to that example. And I have enough game experience and research experience to be able to look up and validate whatever it is that you're saying. Determine whether it fits the question I'm asking or not.
Do you have any freebie questions you suggest maybe knowing?
Preview questions?
Yeah.
I do that very rarely, not on this exam, but I do usually offer more than 100 points, and that becomes the freebie, the extra credit is that I require you to earn it, but the extra credit is there to be earned, not to be generously given to everyone regardless of their knowledge level. I want to reward people who have the preparation and knowledge level rather than just everyone across the board. It becomes proportional to the amount that you know, and that becomes a nice curve, I find. 1 and 2, I can go first.
Were the notes single or double-sided?
Double-sided, yeah. Front and back, totally fine. 1 and 2.
We possibly go over maybe a little bit of, we were talking at one point during one of your lectures, we were talking about like, the like mana to damage ratio.
Yeah,
Like, could you give a little example of that or try to?
yeah. Yeah, so mana in a game, so assuming that we pick a reasonable anchor being something like hit points, then mana can either be converted into healing or into damage. How do you cost some skill in the game is you'll tie it to how much damage it deals or how much health it heals. And that will tell you about how much it should cost. Now you can tweak that, but if you tie it directly to that anchor, it allows you to compare the relative value of different spells by looking at how much damage do they deal. It also can help you to get a situational awareness of when is an appropriate time for the skill to be used. If in the first half of your game, the highest health enemy has 20 HP and you get a skill that has 30 damage, then it's not likely to be used. You're not gonna find it worth casting something that is costed like it's dealing 30 damage when enemies have significantly less health than that. But in the second half of the game where enemies start having more health, maybe now it becomes a better time to start trading off that cost. But if I'm looking at drawing out some kind of example, what does that look like? I'd have to invent something, invent a system that works, but maybe you end up coming up with some curve. It's a linear curve that says every 5 damage that a skill does is worth 1 MP in cost. Every 5 HP that a healing spell does is worth 1 MP in cost. Something like this. Then you could design a base set of skills. The weak attack 1 enemy that deals 5 damage and costs 1 MP. Or maybe even 0 MP, because you want something to be free, a certain amount of damage to be free. Then you could design the medium single target skill that does 10 damage that costs 2 MP. And maybe you want to scale it just a little bit. So the next one is 16 damage for 3 MP. And then 23 damage for 4 MP. You could have a multi-enemy targeting spell. And maybe there's between 1 and 4 enemies that can spawn in a random encounter. Then you can make a weak target all spell that is costed like there are 3 enemies on the screen. So it's really worth casting. If there are 4 live enemies on the screen, you get more damage than the cost, but less worth it if there are 1 or 2 enemies on the screen.
Say that one more time, so you can make like an AoE where it's like.
Yeah, something like an attack all enemies. And if there could be between 1 and 4 enemies on the screen, then a 5 damage spell might cost 3 MP, assuming that it's equal to the single damage if there are 3 enemies on the screen, but you deal 15 damage. For that 5 MP, that sounds, or for that 3 MP, which is right on target, except you're doing it all at once instead of taking 3 characters' turns or the same character over 3 different turns.
So could you argue that it could even use a little more
Yeah.
MP because it's harder to manage to get all of the enemies in your AoE circle? Like you have to wait till the perfect time where they're all in your circle.
Yeah, if it's some kind of action game, if it's more of a turn-based RPG where you get to just target all of them, then yeah, it depends on the game and the genre that you're making. You want to make sure that the game idea is clear. If this is an action game, then if you wanted to cast this, you can anticipate that there are at least 3 enemies in the area of effect in order for it to be worth it.
Okay, so is this the level of detail that would be expected on the exam? You know, just like, would we need to go more depth than that, or is it what you just said about the depth?
That's probably about the depth that I would need. If I was saying, come up with something that has maybe a linear curve. So we haven't really gotten to that point. We're barely talking about cost curves yet, but if something like that were to show up on the exam, then you would say, here's a set of skills, 1, 2, 3, 4, linear curve cost, and I can justify this because blank. Or maybe I give you a table of here's associated damage, come up with a skill that hits all enemies and cost it appropriately. Justify why you assigned that cost based on the anchor being HP. Or tie it back to the anchor if I didn't give you that the anchor was HP.
Should we have Shell's 10 probability things memorized?
I wouldn't memorize much of anything.
Okay.
If you think it's important, throw it on your sheet, but I'm not gonna ask you a direct question like, what is,
Rule 2.
yeah, no. I have no interest in people memorizing
Wait,
things.
what was the question? Sorry, I was tight.
Those 10 rules of probability that were on the slide deck 8, I think. Do you want to memorize those? And they're really there just so that you can build an intuition for how to use math as an analysis. I'm much more interested in, here is a mathematical problem, or here is a game like bulls and cows, come up with some conclusions about it, draw some conclusions about it. And maybe you tie in the rules of probability as to why you can state what you can state. But no, I'm not going to ask a direct question about that because that's annoying memorization.
Oh.
It's something that you can look up. You just Google those 10 rules, there they are. I'm not going to make you memorize something that you can find in a few seconds of looking around. I want to build critical thinking and test your critical thinking skills, not can you jam what is 99.999% of the time useless information into your brain, just so that you can forget it right after the exam.
You don't have to remember like certain probabilities, like you have a bunch of graphs for the probability of rolling a certain number on a d6 and stuff, they don't have to.
I wouldn't say, I'm not gonna say draw it, and I'm gonna judge whether you remember the exact distribution. But I might ask you for something like design a mechanic that is appropriate for a particular kind of dice roll. And then ask you to justify why is that the appropriate dice roll for that mechanic. And then you would be able to use anything you remember or know about the properties of that distribution to support your answer.
So in the study guide, it says, given a game, be able to describe its mechanics mathematically. So are we gonna be given like a bulls and cows type of game and we have to describe it?
Possibly, I would, if I were to do something like that, the game would be very small and self-contained, so I wouldn't use a real game and say, come up with some math for, I don't know, what is a game people play a lot?
SC2.
Sure, we'll use the local Bungie game. So yeah, analyze Destiny 2 and come up with some mathematical conclusion about it. Well, you don't have a computer in front of you. You can't play it. You can't look anything up about it. That wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. But I might give you some very small self-contained game and then say, what mathematical conclusions can you draw from this? But I would probably tie it more specifically than that to have you answer some specific mathematical questions that rely on your understanding something that we covered in class.
So if it's like a dice roll, you want us to be able to explain like the probability?
Potentially,
Okay,
something like, does this dice roll make sense?
okay,
Why or why not? And then you would be able to tie in something about the associated mathematical probability, like you're only going to be successful 20% of the time when you do this. Is this really a good design decision when you're going to fail 80% of the time?
Mhm.
Now I start to question the validity of this as a design decision for this game because of some mathematical analysis of the associated probabilities.
okay.
So that will be the extent of the math.
Yeah,
We're not any like formulas or anything.
No.
Like,
no, anything that was like the advanced bulls and cows that we were doing, no way.
like
It's
the
too
gold-
complex
the
to,
gold Excel.
yeah, no. You're on paper. You're not gonna be able to do anything with a spreadsheet on paper.
That's where I was worried about that. We're gonna need to like make some fancy like math, prove it like using math or something. I'm like,
If I did something like that, I would make it a lab or something that we had significantly more time for. I would not throw that on an exam.
We need to bring a calculator.
No. Everything that I have you do should be doable in your head.
1 hour to balance 3 decks.
Do you expect us to memorize our times tables?
With no question, will you be forced to answer in that way? You will have the option possibly of being able to answer in that way, but there will be a valid answer that does not require you to actually do math. Even if you can just analyze and say, because of this particular outcome, this is true. I'm not going to make you show your work with the math to be able to show that that is true. If it is true, I will understand that your intuition is correct. And if not, if your intuition is not correct, then I might mark you down for something and say, what about, or it seems like you're making this particular assumption or something like that. I know it's very open-ended and my exams are very open-ended, which makes them difficult to study for. That's why I write the kinds of questions that I do on the study guide, because that's the kind of question that you would want to be able to answer. And sometimes I just pull one of those questions. Don't modify it, just throw it on there. Sometimes I modify it a little bit, sometimes I provide a little bit of an example, but target that kind of question. But the questions that are on the study guide were my inspiration for the exam. When I write the exam, I'm looking at the study guide when I do it. So the way that I would prepare for this, if I'm a student in my own class, is I would write answers to all of those questions. And I would put those on your sheet of notes or ideas that you have. When I say something like be able to do something, come up with an example of that. And then say, I'm really interested in applying this to Destiny and showing how that works, or being able to analyze it in this particular way. And then that way you're not trying to come up with something. A good example during the exam, you have a little bit of a note to yourself about if something like this shows up. What I was thinking about last night before I didn't get any sleep was this example. Also get sleep. You come to an exam without sleep, you will perform way worse, even if you studied all night. Get sleep, get food in your system.
I've always tried to think of the balance of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Sleep
I perform-
How much caffeine can I show to my system?
Before it shuts down, yeah. I don't know how this applies to everybody else, but I personally find that I operate at about 50% efficiency if I get less than 7 hours of sleep.
For me, it's less than 8.
Yeah, yeah, that it's somewhere between 50 and 100%, between 7 and 8. But unless I get a good 8 hours of sleep, I do not perform at 100% efficiency.
Where's that mean image of like 8 hours, 7 hours, 6 hours? 4, and then suddenly at 2 hours, you're totally fine.
Yeah, 2 hours. Hey, I'm back. But that only works for one day.
Yeah, it catches up to you real
Yes,
quick.
yes, it does. There was another question, but yeah.
Is it the same length as the last exam?
I tried to make it slightly shorter, but I would anticipate that it's probably going to take you close to, if not the whole time, but 118 points, you don't have to answer absolutely everything to get to the intended points-ish on the exam. I'm not designing it to take longer than an hour. I'm trying to still, if you know what you're doing, you should be able to finish within the hour. But I also recognize that not everybody works exactly the same pace. And so I wanted to make sure that there was at least some more points on this exam to make up for the fact that some people might not finish. That said, that was not my design goal. My design goal was not for people to not finish. It was to test the material on the study guide thoroughly, and then to distribute points in such a way that the extent to which we covered it in class and the importance level that I assigned to it is how many points the questions total when I'm talking about that particular topic. And I find that when I do that, I frequently write fairly long exams, and I go through and try to figure out, is this too long? What can I cut? If I can't cut very much without affecting testing the associated learning outcomes, then I just increase the number of points and or wish that I'd given the exam the week before. I don't think I hit that this time. I think it was the appropriate length. I'm actually pretty happy with the exam. We'll see how it goes, but of course, I always adapt as well. If the entire class is still working on it at the hour, obviously I will curve scores, or I will do something that says that I recognize that I made an exam that was too long.
All right, everyone, we need to just not finish the exam.
See, now this is why I really want to teach game theory, because this is a perfectly viable, logical statement, and we should analyze it for about the next hour. But we don't have that because this is a game theory class.
For 1 hour or for 15 minutes?
For the exam,
Yeah.
yeah, I usually give people the whole hour. So right up until the next class would start. I pick up papers at that point because I don't know if people need to go to that next class or run to that next class. But I will at least make it fair at that point. As I know we can get to our next class if it's in this building in way fewer than 10 minutes. We don't have to walk across campus. We're all in this one building. Yeah,
That's a question. So, for paper prototypes, it says, what are the benefits and detriments? So there's a lot of benefits, but I don't see anything about detriments.
yeah, a lot of the detriments for paper prototyping are frequently when there's no extra benefit to be gained from that paper prototype. So it would take about the same amount of time to construct the paper prototype as it would to design and construct the digital game.
Mhm.
Or if the game is so complex that trying to build a paper prototype for it doesn't map one-to-one, so you have to make significant changes to the rules or mechanics to be able to emulate it on paper, so that the data you collect just doesn't really affect or wouldn't be the same data as collecting data from a digital game.
That paper prototypes can be really slow.
Yeah, and at that point, you would probably say, all right, we should just design a digital prototype and skip the paper prototyping step. Because it's not worth the time and effort and energy to collect all of this data that may not be relevant when we're done with it. But if you can emulate it very nicely, then you can, surprisingly complicated games can be emulated quite well with paper prototypes, which is why we go over it. But there are occasional times where it's just not the best approach.
Could you give like possibly some sort of example of when that would be?
Yeah, so when it's not a good idea,
Guitar Hero.
yeah, anything that requires a real-time mechanic and any kind of twitchy reflex. You can't really, if you're calculating everything on a turn by turn or a time by time basis, you have someone who's calculating, what do you know, what information do you have available to you, how does that affect your decision making? So a competitive first person shooter is also a really difficult type of genre to make a paper prototype for, because a lot of that is reaction time and just time based. How long does it take to navigate the map, collect the weapon I want to use, get to a defensive position? A lot of that is going to be really difficult to make in a paper prototype. Whereas if you design a digital prototype, now you can just query, all right, we know the movement speed of my character. We know, according to, we've implemented A-star pathfinding, we can find the shortest route from here to this particular gun we want to pick up. How long does it take to optimally path to that? We can calculate that off a digital prototype. So now it's worth actually constructing the digital prototype rather than what would we even do on paper? That would be difficult.
If you talk about your exam, it sounds like you should get some play testers for your exam.
Anyone want to volunteer?
Do we get a nicer score?
All right, now you have to pay me $10. Who wants to volunteer? Now you have to pay me $50. Who wants to volunteer? Now you have to pay me $200. Who wants to volunteer?
I made money.
It's an economic system. We're gonna find the market price.
Market prices already paid several dollars.
How about you pay me to play test your exam?
Because there's demand for it. Yeah, there's demand when people pay me. Why would I pay you?
So what was going right there?
It seemed like there was some value in the $100 to $200 range. No, I do not accept bribes. I do not accept bribes, but I at least wanted to tie it to the concept of economic theory we're talking about.
It's not a bribe, we're just play testing your exam.
Yeah, just play testing this real quick.
Hey, look at Path of XL too. It's a $30 buy-in to play test the game. If there's demand for it, you charge for it.
So there's not just the $30, don't think it is free, because I get two, it's not just.
That is true.
Oh, hey, you get to play that, so you go, it's like, no, you get some nice stuff with it, like processing and games. That is true. So, which is more like $10 a
Yeah.
year.
Other questions? What else can I answer?
Looking at the study guide, I don't feel like there are as many open-ended questions as there was on the last one.
Yeah.
I don't have too many questions. Going through and answering, I just basically what you suggested, answering the questions.
Hopefully I won't have to bust out a name for my childhood for the exam. I did that with the last one, I did Zelda Ocarina of Time.
Yeah.
This was like, what has the most stuff I could talk about?
I mean, any of the Half-Life games to good option. I've never played them. I'm sorry.
And I can also put this out there that this is the first time that I am writing and delivering these exams for this class, so I am reasonably interested in.
So we are play testing your exam.
Yeah, I did say that from the beginning.
You're just not play testing it beforehand, you're play testing it for the next class that takes it next year. But yeah, if you do have feedback, you feel like things are too long, some questions were unclear, unfair, anything of the sort, I am interested in that feedback. And I can, if enough people tell me that kind of feedback, then that also informs looking at the grades as well, whether an end of class curve is justified or not. So I do collect a lot of that data, and I do feed that back into the grades as well as the design of the exam, so.
So if you get a better grade, we all need to tell you that the test was awful.
And don't finish it, that's what I'm saying, just
Yeah.
sit there, answer 3 questions and just sit there.
See, you get an classic prisoner's dilemma there, though. Going back to game theory,
There's gonna be that one person that completes the whole thing.
yeah, throws off the curve for everybody. So it's a big risk to do
Account
that.
for geniuses, okay?
If you do it, you have to make sure that everybody does it, when it's not in everyone's best interest. The only way to be sure is to do your best.
We'll just pull a page out of your book, we'll show up with a whip and just, no one's gonna do anymore.
I think I'd have to report that.
Rubber gun, that's the only thing they prohibit, is guns.
Can you give us a refresher on possibility space?
Yeah, so possibility space was basically all of the state action pairs in the game. So what are all of the possible states that the game could be in? And then for each one of those spaces, what can be done? What are the possible actions? So we could look at chess. I think we did that in class. Chess's possibility space is quite large, but not infinite. So what was important about the possibility space of chess? What was involved in that?
Directly typing what moves to do it certain.
Yeah, so there's the entire board state. We need to know exactly what square every single piece is in. Who owns that particular piece? We need to know whose turn it is. And we probably also need to know whether the king is in check.
We also need to know the last move that was taken by the previous player.
Okay, we could reasonably, is that important for the state? Does that change anything about?
Yes,
On
on passant, yeah.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, if you're to include any en passant rules, then yes, we do need to know whether a pawn was moved from their starting position to two spaces up.
So when we move into like something that's not turn-based, like like an action RPG or something, what would the possibility space look like there? It's like constantly moving,
Yeah, if it's a real-time game,
Think Elden Ring or Dark Souls.
then just think about what matters, what would change what you want to do. Something like your position relative to the closest enemies. That means if you have some kind of sword swipe that you can do, how many enemies would that hit right now? So you could account for your character's XY position, You could account for any enemy's XY position. You could account for the range of the equipped weapon, because one of the actions would be to change your equipped weapon. Maybe you change from a sword to a pickaxe or something else, but that would be an action from that point.
Like a bow.
Right now, you can only use the item that you have out, maybe. So there are a lot of those. The possibility space is very large if an XY position is continuous, or is broken down and has a precision of 3 decimal places or 7 decimal places. It becomes a very, very large possibility space, but you can still describe it by saying something like every relevant character's position relative to each other. How much gold do you have? How much of any particular resource you have at this precise moment? Basically, it's like debugging your code, stepping through it at a particular point in what looks like continuously running code. What is the state of everything that you care about in your code right now? What are all the structures? What are all the values of all the structures? What are blowing that up into everything? And a game is going to have a lot of that. You can also think about what would be required to save the state of this game. If you were to immediately open the pause menu and save, what would you need to save to be able to reload this exact moment in time? That might be another way to think about it.
Wouldn't that in that situation, couldn't that very easily be a lot more than the probability space, at least for the player though? Because if you have to synchronize stuff like the internal state of the AI, like to save, that's stuff that's not reasonably part of the player's possibility space, because there's no way they can know.
Right, that is true. But it is also technically part of the possibility space in that if the AI, that's a valid point. That is a valid point. If it's algorithmic, how does the AI take this state and decide what to do from this state? That is not embedded in the state itself. That is embedded in the AI algorithm's analysis of the current state to decide what move the AI should do next. So you don't need to store that information, because as soon as you load the game, that calculation will be done and the AI will make that action. If that makes sense.
You to rank the slides in order of importance, what would they rank?
I would say, based on the length of the study guide for that particular section, that's a pretty good indicator of how, when I looked through those slides and thought, what could I reasonably ask about this? Or what could I reasonably have people think about as they're studying for this? If there's not much there, there's not much that I can write a question about. I did want to target every single chapter with at least one question.
I think slide deck 7 is the most important one.
Yeah, absolutely. The one, the one you don't even have.
There's a conspiracy.
What else? Any other confusions or questions that are on there that you'd like me to talk about or have a back and forth about? That just doesn't seem like I have a direction that I would go with this type of question.
Other than health, what is another like common anchor?
Let's analyze chess. What's the anchor in chess?
The king?
Yeah, where the king is, the relative attack positions to the king. The king doesn't have health, but yeah, the king is what ties everything else to it, both in your opponent's offense and your own defense.
So the objective?
So yeah, the objective is usually different from or I guess sometimes they can be tied together. Like the objective related to health is don't die.
So basically the thing that can make you lose.
Yeah, preventing losing and the strategy that a player uses is usually around that. It's either actively seeking out winning or it's preventing losing at the current moment. So your anchor, how you're going to balance everything else in the game, is very frequently going to be tied to what you want your player to be strategizing around. Yeah,
Can you go into how are system interactions similar to integration testing?
yeah, so. In integration testing, you have some large project and you're each individually working on some subset of that. That's not to say that the eventual outcome of this large scale project, the piece that I am working on is going to need to communicate with the piece that you are working on. As I'm developing my piece and you are developing your piece, we can't test this. So eventually I'm going to complete what I think is my working piece, and you're going to complete what you think is your working piece. Once we've done this, we kind of stick them together where now my code can call your code. And now I can check and see and test, does your code return to me what I expect it to? Or is there some issue in the communication or in your logic where I'm expecting that the logic you're doing is different from the logic that you're doing? So in game testing, usually you're working on different components. In a large scale company, if you have a lot of people working on different components, think of a large scale, difficult AAA game to make. There are hundreds of developers all working simultaneously on different components. What is it like when we can finally connect those components for the first time? We're going to find a bunch of bugs due to poor communication between people, lack of detail in the specification for what needs to be done. If it was ambiguous and person A interpreted it in some fashion and person B interpreted it in some other fashion, then you're going to have some clash when these components come together and A expects that B works in a different way than B works.
Wait, so what's, so that was integration, so what's?
Yeah, for games, you're working on different components, just like it's exactly like a large scale application from any other field of computer science, is that lots of different people are going to be working concurrently on independent components, but those components will need to communicate with each other eventually.
And that's the system interaction?
Yeah. Yeah, so you have systems within the game. I am the battle system designer. And so I'm balancing the drops from the battle system to make sure that that is fun and interesting and rewarding compared to the difficulty of the fight. But you're controlling the resource. Maybe you're part of the resource sinks and you're coming up with how is this currency going to be removed from the system? But I generate more resources than you think I am in the battle system. By the time the battle system is testable and connectable to your resource management system, then you realize, wow, you're generating way more resources than I've been trying to sink. We need to fix this.
Trying to think of an anchor that isn't just self-reversing, and wondering what would be the anchor for Factorio, or be like time?
There's a pretty significant component of time there, but
You still can die in Factorio. It's not really like the focus that things are balanced around.
Well, not really use that. Even
it can be something like the size of your factory, because if you're the AI trying to figure out, all right, how do I reasonably challenge the player with an assault that the player can adequately defend if they strategize well? If you have a small factory and a large factory, that is different. So how would you balance the curve of the difficulty to throw at a player based on what it is that they have? So that would become more like your anchor.
Oh,
It's a really good question.
Back to the curves one, when you say, how can we determine an appropriate mathematical relationship with the pressure between game objects and systems? You said we're not gonna have to do like anything crazy for that, or can you give me an
It will
example?
not be super crazy. If anything, I would either give you an example and say, is this well structured or not? What other curve would you use that might feel better to play, justify it? Or I would say, give me a mechanic that felt imbalanced in some game that you've played, thinking about its mathematical relationship. How could that have been improved? Or diving into the mathematical relationship for this issue that felt imbalanced, try to analyze that mathematically. What was the issue mathematically?
And it's not gonna be anything super complex.
No, a lot of it will be generating examples, critical thinking, tying it to experience that you have, tying some idea to experiences that you have, or experiences to material in the class, something like that. I like my open-ended questions.
You can tell.
I also hate my grader apparently. Open-ended questions are really hard to grade. I don't hate Hunter, but he probably hates me at this point.
I'm just worried I'm gonna have trouble coming up with examples for. Whatever you end up putting on there.
I would say my advice for any question that has an example like that, give yourself about 10 seconds. If you can't come up with a reasonable starting point within 10 seconds, skip the question. Come back to it at the end. That will be, you'll be thinking about that underneath the hood as you're answering other questions, so that when you come back to it, you'll probably have done some subconscious thinking about it. So don't spend a lot of time on something that you're struggling to come up with a place to start with. Create it kind of like a software engineering. You're going to come up with a minimally viable product. You're going to come up with a minimally viable exam that you can hand in. On a first pass, to be what can I easily answer? On a second pass, it's what can I reasonably answer within a minute? On the next pass, what can I eventually you just have the real critical thinking questions at the very end that require you to generate something. And if you don't generate that, then at least you got everything else and it wasn't a roadblock to completing the rest of the exam. If you're also really struggling to come up with something,
Skip it, come back to it.
you may be able to, if it's the last thing, if you're coming back to it and you're still really stuck, come talk to me.
Wing it.
Wing it, or just say, I'm really struggling to come up with an example for this. And maybe I can do something like, all right, what are list your top 5 favorite games? Have you list those off, and then I will help you critically think and say, lock in on number 4. What about this particular system in that? Or what could you analyze about something? Maybe I can help you to generate the example and then leave you to do the analysis. That would be kind of the worst case. But I don't want you to leave something blank because you can't come up with a good example for it. That's not from my shoes, that's not a valid reason to leave something blank. I want to help you to be able to put something on the page. Last 3 minutes. Are people feeling reasonably confident, hopefully, or have I scared you?
I am scared.
I'll let you know when it's sitting in front of me.
During the exam.
Damn it, Kane!
Yeah, let's look up, go, the same.
I mean, based on the last exam, I felt like I knew all the material, but I just didn't feel like I was able to answer everything the way I wanted to. Yeah.
I'm trying to not do that this time, or at least if that does become an issue, then there are 18 extra points, so it won't actually affect the letter grade that people end up.
I'm not used to writing things anymore, so my hand cramps like halfway through now.
Yeah, that's also fair.
I remember I was like, some of the questions on the last exam were like, okay, apply this, apply this to a video game you play. And like, I knew what it was talking about, but like, my brain was just like, we have never played a video game in my life. I could not think of an example. I just could not.
If that's the case, skip it, come back to it, otherwise come talk to me and I might be able to get you started.
Got it.
All right, I'll see you tomorrow. We don't want to give you, but I'm contractually obligated to give you.
Sorry.
You're contractually obligated to do a test, but how hard it is, if I don't do that, then I have to find something else to grade you on, otherwise it becomes a small sample size bias. Something else becomes overly important, way more important than it should.
Yeah, sorry, I used to act. I looked at